Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Success is Complicated podcast. I am your host, Raquel.
And I am your co-host, Sierra Davis.
And today we wanted to talk about trauma. We know that in today's world, depending on who you're listening to or who you're following, and they say that everybody has trauma. And while I get it, we want to explore that a little bit more because it doesn't necessarily mean that there's a lot of truth in that everybody has trauma. So Sierra, I'm gonna go ahead and pass the mic over to you because truth be told, it's a touchy conversation because you don't want to invalidate people's experiences. Because the truth about trauma is you start to experience trauma based off of how you perceive your situation. So in essence, anything can be trauma.
Right. And of course, y'all, I came up with this topic.
She did.
And Raquel was like, trauma? Why trauma? And honestly, I feel like that is one of the areas in life where it can hold a lot of us back from being our greater selves, right? And when we talk about trauma, this morning I got in my head, I'm like, oh my God, like, am I qualified to talk about trauma? And then I was like, you know what? It's a human experience, right? So I'm definitely not trying to I guess not talk about like, oh, your trauma is not that bad or you can just move past it, because I do think that we really have our own walks when it comes to trauma. But I think what is understood is that we all at some point experience trauma. However, the world doesn't have to define what trauma is for you.
Right. And one of the things is, because I'll be honest, even though I'm a mental health professional, I don't feel equipped to talk about trauma either. And I think because of the word.
I
and
was like,
it's
you
really,
took a class. You should be good.
I did crisis intervention, but still, like it's really about, and you don't want to invalidate people's experiences. So maybe we take it a step back and let's talk about what trauma is, right?
Right.
Because trauma is an experience. It's not just an event.
Right.
And a lot of times we like, oh, this event, but it's an experience that starts to have you feeling like you're helpless, hopeless, like you have no control of a situation,
Right.
to where you're like really fighting for safety or survival. And I thought about it, right? Because I had thought about like, how did we grow up, right? We didn't have a whole lot.
Right.
And the experience of not having a whole lot, because it's not about an event. Like you go like a long time without like not having a lot. But when you talk about like, did we have the things that we needed? And that doesn't necessarily mean that we agree with everything that took place in childhood, but being poor, most people will say like there's, it's traumatic.
Right. There's a traumatic event happening if you're living in poverty. If you're, if things don't happen the way that you think they should, it's a traumatic event. But reality is I wouldn't say that I had everything, all of the things growing up. And by definition, I was poor. I was poor.
Yeah, by definition.
By definition. But in spirit,
Me
baby.
too.
No. I don't think I had everything growing up, and I was definitely considered poor, but I wouldn't say that my childhood was traumatic.
So I'm thinking about that because the poor thing does not necessarily resonate with me, because I knew that at some point you become an adult and you get to choose for yourself. I've always understood that even as a child.
Right.
Now, I would say like, so it makes me go back and think about events, right? Like watching my mom, and you was there too. You had the same experience because we were there together. Like watching her die from an overdose, it's an event. But I guess the experience of it, like what made it traumatic, if it was traumatic, right? Because I think that, I'm trying to make sure I don't invalidate my experiences, shit, even your experiences too, because we were there together on that night. And if we talk about feeling helpless, hopeless, like fighting for safety and survival, I don't think it hit me until after that, right? Because what does life look like after? Like, now that my mom is not here, where do we go? We go to an unfamiliar place. We go into a household that we don't necessarily know. Now, I would say I've always been that child that knew how to like transition or change my thinking so that it could work for me. So I don't know like the longevity of feeling traumatized per se, because I mean, eventually my dad and I, we would clash, and then we were able to build a relationship to where I felt safe, where I didn't necessarily feel like now that doesn't mean that everything was perfect, but there was a sense of safety, and safety for me.
Mm-hmm.
So that experience, or I mean, not that experience, but that event wasn't what was traumatic for me. It was, you start to feel helpless and hopeless as a child. You start thinking about like what's next for your life. Like the consistency of not having anything, or when I say not having anything, like we didn't have what people, I guess what they consider middle class and all of that had. But that was consistent. That was pretty consistent in terms of not having those things. So I don't know that being poor, if anything, it makes you think like I just want more for my life, and having the opportunity to see that, you know, if you go on the other side of the tracks, people are living differently. When you think about where we trick-or-treated at, like, and took our pillowcases and all of that, like people on the other side of the tracks, they were living differently. So you're like, you know, this is possible. This is another way of living. And I think when you start to think about it from an adult perspective, when you do become an adult, you do have more choices. And I think that that's the biggest thing. Now and that's what this topic, why did you choose this topic?
Why did I choose it? I chose the topic because I really think that trauma is one of the things that hold us back in life, like from really being able to move forward into like our optimal selves, right? Because we get stuck on an event.
An experience,
right? We get stuck on an experience to where you can constantly be reliving that experience that happened 20 years ago in the present moment. And
that's true.
When you do that, how are you showing up for the present moment? How can you take advantage of the opportunities that are in the present moment? So, I mean, that was my main reason for choosing trauma, because I'm not deciding what's going to help someone, right?
Right.
But Raquel truly believe in paradigm shifts, and I mean, I do too, right? So I would hope that someone will watch our podcast and hear something.
Right. No, that's true. Because, you know, my mind going to PTSD and all those things, and just really understanding that there are some people that struggle with the ability to make those paradigm shifts, right?
Right.
So I would say the first thing we are not giving mental health advice at all or ever on this podcast. Like, you have to have the ability to go out and seek information for yourself, and being able to expand your mind to listening to other things that will challenge the way that you think, because science is also very limiting, right? We were talking about on our drive here, causation versus correlation. And just
what is
because
causation versus correlation, Raquel? Because I heard you say that in the car. I was like, causation, correlation. What?
Well, you know, like, so let's just say a set of researchers, or how they, because I saw this said, if you grow up in a household with dysfunctional parents, that is trauma. Like, and that's definitive, right?
Right.
Like, we're saying that if you grow up in dysfunction, then causation, like that dysfunction has caused you trauma. And that's not necessarily true. In fact, it's very limiting for
the human experience.
Yeah, it's very limiting for the human experience, because I don't necessarily know that dysfunction stops per se, however you define it, right? Because as you continue to grow up and have more experiences, even as yourself as an adult, right? There may be experiences that just don't feel good, cause a lot of discomfort to you, but how you perceive those experiences matters. I seen a post the other day where someone has said that they wish they had never grew. Like, they wonder like what would have been different if they weren't so afraid of their parents. and like if they had created an environment that felt safe for them. And what she was speaking to was there was a lot of structure, there was a lot of rules. You get your ass whipped and all those typical stuff that we may hear like in a Black household. But you also could see the success, right? Like she's done very well for herself. Now I'm not invalidating her experiences, because rightfully so, they have impacted her. But based off of because there's always this nature versus nurture, right?
Right.
And when you start, if you're a parent, you have kids right now, you can probably tell like what their personality is. Like, I need to alter how I parent this child because of X. And like, I always say like Caden is very strong-willed, and he has a little bit of that perfectionism going on. And I'm not taking credit. Like last night, he kept telling Hakeem, put your seatbelt on. Put your seatbelt, because Caden believes that there's a right way to do things. Right. And Hakeem is more on the other side. It ain't that serious. Nobody even noticed that I didn't have my seatbelt on. Like, what are you tripping about? And, you know, Caden, in a lot of ways, he reminds me of me, because as a child, I was very judged. I'm like, what are y'all doing? Like, this isn't right. And what ends up happening is how you judge those experiences versus truly seeing people as humans, that does limit your ability to be able to think outside of the box. So going back to causation versus correlation, right? Poverty. There's some correlation with having traumatic experiences, like it impacting your mental health. Like there's some correlation there, but it doesn't necessarily mean that everything that ends up happening or that you end up experiencing, like that's the direct cause of it.
Right.
Like nobody really knows that. And I think that when we get so caught up in science, that's the part that drives niggas, because everything ends up being so fact-based that nothing is faith-based anymore.
Oh, I like that. Everything is so fact-based that it's not faith-based anymore. Tell us about that. Come on.
So I'm going to go back and think, because when you told me that you wanted to do this podcast, I was like, you wanted to do this episode on trauma. I was like, it's such a touchy topic. I was like, I don't know that I really want to touch it. And when you go back to based on facts, like there are a lot of facts that like I get it and I truly understand it.
Well, that's what was driving me crazy this morning, right? The facts. Like,
right.
Am I qualified? Like, I ain't even took no course on trauma. Like, so how I'm gonna tell the people anything about trauma? So I do get what you're saying, like fact. But when you talk about faith, I think my life experience, and of course, I feel like I've experienced some form of trauma, but it's faith that truly gets me through those things. So I think that just being a human, I can talk to people about trauma.
I would agree. I'm starting to loosen up a little bit as we begin to talk about it, because and just going back to this podcast could be limiting for somebody because it doesn't resonate or it doesn't support like your views of the world. And I think that sometimes when we get so caught up in science, like not realizing that science can be so limiting as well, because you know, I always talk about this whole adult development thing, and I realized that like I had gotten caught up in that socialized mindset, right? I need something to validate my abilities to even be able to speak about trauma. And if you see a lot of therapists out here, they qualify in relationships, trauma, marriage, working with kids. And when you really go to talk about like what is psychology, it's the understanding of humans. And while I have worked with a bunch of humans and interact with a bunch of humans, I don't believe that I am like that I understand us completely, because it's just too complex.
Right, we are complex beings.
So that whole causation versus correlation for me, like there's no definitives. Like this X calls Y. That's not like the way that life, that's not the way that life works. I don't give a damn what science says in that sense.
So I get what you're saying. Like, because something happened, that does not mean that's why you're doing what you're doing today.
No.
It's not correlated. It doesn't mean it has to be correlated.
Right. Well, it doesn't mean that it's caused it.
Okay.
It doesn't mean that
it could be correlated,
it.
But it doesn't mean it's the cause.
Right, because sometimes the cause is just people not wanting to take responsibility, because at some point at some point, especially when so shout out to everybody that is going to therapy, they're trying to fill in those gaps and they're getting the tools that they feel like they didn't necessarily have. Like, that's like accountability. That's taking responsibility. But I also think that when you are listening to these so-called experts, and I am the queen of the person that would like to listen to an expert because you need that validation. But sometimes you don't realize that you can lose your inner voice within that too.
Right.
And it doesn't feel like it because I have something to support what I'm saying. But that's the socialized mindset. Like, all of these things are constructs. Science is a construct. This podcast is a construct.
And when we truly go to think about even science, right, what it tells us, science is a hypothesis. It's a hypothesis, and then causation versus there are subjects that are put into a controlled environment, right? A controlled environment, and then from there, you get a, what do they call that? What do they call what you get after that?
A sample.
You get the science. You get the science. You get the science after that.
Well, you just made me think. I remember when I had started this journey to becoming a mental health professional, and they kept showing the data on like Black people. Somehow, I don't know. I just think that the world is obsessed with Black. More important, I think that the world is obsessed with, like, they can't figure out like the causation versus correlation. Like, how can they experience these things and then end up on the other side of it and still thriving? And maybe thriving still has some maladaptive ways, but they're still like overcoming.
Right.
And when I used to listen to the data, it's like, okay, where did the data come from? Because that's important, right? Where did the data come? If you continue to pull the data from the areas where you and I grow, of course the data is probably going to continue to show the same things. Like, it's not going to necessarily change because people don't have money. People don't have resources. It's the lack of education. And we do know that there is a correlation between resources, education, and money.
Right. I would definitely agree with that, and especially when it comes to like mental health and getting the help to deal with those traumas, right? If you can't necessarily deal with the trauma that you've experienced, or your parents can't even speak to you about the trauma that you're experiencing, how can you truly overcome it?
Right.
But in our community, maybe we're not overcoming the traumas, but we're pushing the limits all around everything else. Like, but with it being Black History Month, right? And you brought up Black people and how they want to, find out how are we pushing forward despite some of the things that we've experienced in our culture. How do you feel like Black people are traumatized?
I mean, we can be. I mean, if I want to play victim real quick. I mean, there are a lot of reasons why we could say that we are traumatized, right? Like, when you look at what happens in the world, like all of the political things. But I would say that most recent incident that happened, what was the guy's name? Tyree or Kyrie with the officers? Mm-hmm. I think that was a teaching moment for us.
Right.
And I think that what ends up happening is we like to make ourselves the subject of the universe, and teaching moment in a lot of ways, because people that look like us took and did inflicted pain, caused death, and we thought it was a white thing. And granted, there still is the political situations around the oppressors and people having this power. But what you realize is when you're dealing with humans, power plays an important part in it. Like, I don't think that incident was about race, but your mind can get so focused on how you think it is that you're not open to other things. And nobody's really talking about it like it was us that did that this time. So where's the accountability in that, in a sense? And then people will change the story and say, oh, well, they got indicted like very quickly. And I don't know the details because I don't choose to look into all of the details. But I think that humans, I mean, when you think about people that have power, even in positions of leadership, people abuse power.
Right.
Is it really about black? No, people abuse power. Like, I've been in a leadership position before, and I'm sure I have abused my power to where it has inflicted or caused pain on somebody else.
So I think I hear what you're saying when I say, do you feel like the black culture is traumatized? And then you said the whole Trey moment was a teaching moment.
I don't know his name. I don't think his name is Trey.
Anybody know his name in the studio? No, I don't know his name either. I'm sorry. But I get what you're saying when you say it's a teaching moment, because we get so focused on we get so focused on color, right? This happened. If you're a black man, the police is beating you because you're black, and it must be white police officers. But I guess when you talk about holding several perspectives, right? Mm-hmm. It's more so if you're human and you hold any sort of power, you may abuse it.
Yeah. His name is Tyree Nichols.
Tyree.
Yeah, Tyree Nichols.
Thank you for looking it up, Rockwell, because I think when it comes to saying somebody's name, like, you want to say it right. So, yeah. Tyree Nichols.
Tyree Nichols. Yeah. Just going back to, because yesterday I had told Sierra, I was like, Sierra, did you know that there's a such thing as post-traumatic growth disorder? And she was like, how do you say growth and traumatic in the same sentence? And just talking about, because we often hear post-traumatic stress disorder.
Right.
But on the other side of that, we never talk about post-traumatic growth disorder. And it really is a thing. Like, go ahead and look it up for the people that need.
Is it a disorder, though? Like, I don't like the word disorder in the post-traumatic growth. Like, why we can't just call it post-traumatic growth? I don't think it's disorder.
But tomato. You can create it and make it to be whatever you want it to be. But it really is a such thing. And if you think about COVID, right? A lot of people say that COVID has been a traumatic experience.
And some people say that COVID has been the best thing that has ever happened for them.
Yeah, but that's the growth side of it, right? Because you start to really tap into, like, you understand that people understand they have options now.
Right.
They have more choices than what they've had available, even though those choices have always been available.
Right.
It's just that we didn't necessarily exercise them because for whatever reason, right?
It's like being in that prison with the door open, but you never really walk out.
You never really think to walk through it. I was thinking about because this trauma thing, it is so touchy, and I have gotten clients from a therapy standpoint that have had experiences to where you were like, "Whoa, that is so bad." And I always say that as a therapist or coach, we all work from like our way of being and like our own spirituality. And I remember this one particular client, this client had experienced sexual assault as a child from a family member. And I was like, that is so bad. Like, oh my gosh, how does she recover from that? She'll never recover from it. And then I learned, like, it's not learned, but I thought about, like, is this the way that Quail operates? And it's not the way that Quail operates, because I never want to find myself judging people's experiences, because if I start judging your experience, I put constraints and limits on you in terms of how you can grow.
Right, or limiting people's growth because of how you see their
experiences. And I remember a couple sessions in, I spent the time like validating her experiences. I was the second therapist she had worked with, and we were talking about this family member, and something personal had hit me too, and I had started thinking about grace. And we had started talking about suffering, and she was saying how this person had moved on with their lives and she was still here, like, suffering. And spiritual, right? Or you can say religious, however you want to think about it. I was thinking, like, we don't get to choose how God shows grace to other people. And I was like, do I share this with her? Because in my head, I'm like, she's had an unfavorable experience. Like, I don't want to invalidate that. And then I was like, I just got to trust myself. And I asked her, I said, do you mind if I share something with you? And we had started talking, And you could tell she was a mom, like she had goals. And when you talk about like that trauma, right?
Right.
That was an experience that felt like she had to like fight for herself. She felt very helpless. And it's easy to feel helpless and hopeless as a child, right? Because other people are responsible for you.
Right.
So, you know, understanding that, but also understanding that, all right, she wants more. And I know how you say, like, you can be a prisoner, but the door is like, you know, for us, if you're not literally like in jail, like the door is always open. And sometimes we have to choose to step on the other side of it. And that's where accountability lies. And I told her, and I was like, look, I understand like what you experienced like was not good. And as a child, you should have never had to experience that. But what do you want for yourself today? Because it sounds like X person has decided to move on and we don't know whether they're happy or not.
And I always say when it comes to what a person who has inflicted pain is dealing with, like we never can decide. Like they can look happy all they want to, but baby, when you lay down at night, I don't know what you go through.
Right. And that's what I was telling. And I don't remember how the conversation went, but I got outside of my head and said, like, I'm not going to necessarily follow what science tells me that she's had this experience. So this is how you treat her. And she ended up saying, because I will cry on that. She ended up saying like, thank you for like seeing me and seeing beyond my circumstances. And I got really, really emotional because I started like questioning how I should work with her because, you know,
you want to be delicate.
You want to be delicate. No child should ever have to experience something like that, right? And I'm getting emotional now because, you know, like I understand that, you know, life can be hard and it feels hard. But when you just, you know, when you look at like the value of resiliency and being able to not take life so personal and, you know, being able to sit in gratitude because you get a chance to do it differently.
Right.
That's what ends up mattering. And I don't think that there's a lot of conversations around that because everybody is trying to tell everybody like who you are. And we tell people who they are based off of facts. And for me, if you're going to talk about being multiculturally competent as a mental health professional, you can't leave out spirituality or religion in terms of how you work with people. Like you can't. And if you're bringing it in there and you're judging people's experiences, I'm not saying that you're not God-like or any of those other things, but to me, it's an opportunity for other people to explore because the person that sits behind that chair has their own set of experiences, their own set of belief systems, and those belief systems can also be very limiting too. And I think that, you know, I always say society grants professionals privilege. The society says you get a pass because you have these letters behind your name, you have this title behind your name, and nobody questions what anybody says. And the truth is, like, professionals can make mistakes too.
Right.
And when I say make mistakes, do things that end up not necessarily serving
the client.
Yeah, serving the client.
So, Quell, what I hear you saying is when it comes to trauma, be open to a different perspective because that is where the shift happens. So that way you're not stuck in, you know.
I think you have to ask valid questions, right? If we go back to like, do I still feel hopeless today based off of a past event or experience?
Right.
Do I still feel helpless today based off of a past event or experience? Do I still feel like I have to fight? And then some of the questions you got to ask yourself, am I still fighting with what caused it or any of it? And I think that those are not the questions like, you know, therapy or coaching, like the right questions have to be asked. I mean, there's the such things as the right questions.
I agree.
Because if you're not asking the right questions, you can end up feeling like you're on this hamster wheel forever.
Right.
So when you say like, do I still feel like I'm fighting or I'm trying to survive? Because sometimes we don't even realize how far we've come.
Right. And we allow the world.
Sometimes
or
we don't even
people
realize that
around
we're
us
out of the situation.
to tell us that we're
not
still traumatized.
negating people that live with PTSD, because that's a whole nother issue. But that ain't even the focus. Like, I'm not even gonna try to like appease to everybody. Like I'm gonna let that go in this episode, because this may or may not be for you.
Right.
It just may or may not be for you.
I mean,
and that's okay.
Essentially what we're saying is that there's hope on the other side of trauma.
Yeah, I mean, it is.
There's hope on the other side of
trauma. But not all of us experiences trauma in the same way, because remember, trauma is the way that you perceive your situation. So you and I could have experienced the same thing and it be trauma for me and not necessarily trauma for you. And I think that is important to understand, because what we end up saying is, ooh, they both experience this, they're traumatized. Do not try to tell me that I'm traumatized without exploring like me first.
So, Raquel, when we were like, I believe we were 16 years old and we were hit by a drunk driver. A lot of people, I mean, I've seen people out on the side of the road with, don't drive under the influence signs and stuff like that, which means that they could have had a similar experience or could have lost someone due to driving under the influence, right? That may be a place of trauma for them. But you and I experienced...
My neck and my back was hurting.
Our experiences in that moment was very, very different, right? Very, very different.
Were we supposed to be on the road at that time?
I don't know. I mean, we was...
I don't think that we were supposed to even be on that road, on the road at the time. So I got hurt instantly.
Well, not only was she hurt, Raquel was like, okay, what we gonna do? I was like, let's go get his ass. Like, he didn't just hit us.
And my neck and my back was hurting.
But I think that is I guess how trauma can work, right? Like, I experienced one thing, you experienced something else. And I don't think that this was a traumatic event for either one of us. Based off of how we just allowed ourselves to be and to perceive it. I mean, we didn't make the person driving under the influence a bad person. And I'm by no means am I saying that it's okay to drive under the influence. But what I am saying is that person was human. They hit two 16-year-olds and tried to take off.
Nose runs.
And we jumped into action. Well, I jumped into action.
You jumped into action. I wasn't even supposed to have been outside at that time. So, I probably after this podcast, I think I'm going to go back and just kind of like think about, I don't know, because I guess it's just very hard for me to say that once because I really understand that I have agency over my life.
Right.
So I guess it's very hard for me to say, that I've had all of these traumatic experiences, because I'm not where I started.
Right.
Like, I guess this is very hard for me. Like, I don't feel like it's very hard to say that I feel helpless and hopeless today. And some of that is spiritual, because God gives us a lot of authority and dominion and power. So for me to say that as an adult, for me, would be very difficult. And that's just based off of my beliefs.
But, I also think that says a lot around trauma and like how we can overcome. Because I think here today we've mentioned several instances where it should have, by society's definition of trauma, should have been traumatizing to either me or you. But it's truly your perspective and how you see the world, right? And also your faith.
That is just so it's really important. And I think that, I understand from a kid's perspective, right? Because faith is kind of, kids are still thinking
They're
very
still figuring out
concretely. They're
faith.
still, that's something that you're still figuring out. Like,
Right.
I need to be able to see it to really understand it. But I do think that as adults, we have to be very careful about how we judge and label our experiences.
Right.
Because I mean, anything could be bad, unfavorable, but when you get into labeling your experiences, it kind of takes away. It made me think like if it ain't good yet, then God just ain't done with it yet.
Oh, right.
And if you've already labeled that experiences, I feel like you've already taken God out of the equation.
I like that.
So for me, that matters, and I'm particular about like what I listen to and what I take in, because we have the pen. We're constantly writing these narratives and these stories, right? And your ability to create and assign meaning in your life, like it really, really does matter. Like for the people that end up like overcoming or on that other side, post-traumatic growth disorder.
Can you tell us what that is again?
It means that what may have been traumatic for somebody else may not have necessarily been traumatic for you, because they've been able to grow beyond whatever those experiences were.
Okay. So I was thinking before is, while it may have been a traumatic experience for someone, that they're able to shift their perspectives
Basically.
on what happened in that situation, so that way they can assign meaning to it to create growth in life.
Right. Well, that's another thing too, because when you talk about shifting perspectives, remember I was telling you the other day, like it's not even about me shifting perspectives. Like it's like, do you believe what you say?
Right.
Like,
right.
Do you truly believe like what you say? Because I think that if you spend so much time trying to shift your perspectives, you always end up feeling like conflict, because you don't really believe like what you say. Like we always say, my favorite scripture is, don't be anxious about anything.
Right.
And I don't remember scriptures like that, but I know how they say, don't be anxious about anything, but in times of need, present your requests, blah, blah, yeah, all of what it says. But basically, don't be anxious about anything, right? So like for me, it's not about like shifting my perspective. Like that belief is solid for me. If I feel myself getting worked up, I'm trying to take control. And I'm real good at it. Like I sometimes I feel like that I can step into like God's shoes, and that just doesn't feel good to me. Been there, done that already.
No,
so
too big, too heavy.
I'm not a big fan on like shifting your perspectives, because I feel like they're temporary. They're temporary. I think that the focus is really on finding out who you are, because what you think is a reflection of who you are.
Well, I guess when I say, I think it's really good that you dive in on shifting perspectives.
Right.
Because
people say reframe, like you need to reframe that thought.
Well, and you want to believe.
You need to believe.
Believe at the core something different than what you believed before.
Right.
I mean, and just and just a blanket statement around why it should have been different or could have been different is not going to get you to belief.
Right.
I think that you truly have to see the facts in order to be able to shift perspectives and get into belief.
But the thing about facts ain't always facts, right?
Because facts for you.
Right.
Facts for you.
Right.
What rings true for you.
Right.
And as you said, like when we talk about true and truth, like everything ain't always the truth.
Right. It's only everything, because what I'm saying right now, I said it, and she believes what she's saying right now is true because she says it and she believes it. So I guess to like wrap up this conversation, because I enjoyed it. I did. I enjoyed it, and I'm glad that I tell people, get a community or find you that person that will challenge the way that you think about life and the way that you approach life. Because yesterday when Sierra texted me and said, let's talk about trauma tomorrow, and I was like, ugh. And she could immediately feel like my energy, and she was like, if you don't want to talk about this, and I was like, no, we're gonna do it. But find you a community that will challenge the way that you think about life, that will challenge your worldviews, because a lot of times what we don't realize is we choose happiness. Happiness is not based off of the external events that are happening, those external experiences that you have had. You have to choose to be happy. And in order to choose to be happy, you have to be grounded in something beyond what science says, what society says. Sometimes, you have to be grounded in something bigger than. And I always say, when I was working with my coach, he used to use like that image of like the ocean, right? Like at the top, you see all of the waves and it's a lot of action happening. And then if you go to the bottom of it, it's like peaceful.
Still.
It's still. And I would say, I feel like I'm at that place in my life. When somebody asked me yesterday, it was like, well, what's the code? Like, how do you get there? And when I figure it out, I'm going to package it and I'm going to sell it. But I haven't figured it out yet, because it's understanding that humans are complex, right? Like our walks and our journeys are truly different. But I think it starts with having a community that will challenge the way that you think, because nothing that you say is true. Like yesterday, I was thinking that, I'm not equipped to really talk about trauma. I don't know that anybody really is equipped to talk about it, because it's complex. And
I think, honestly, when we talk about the people who are probably talking about trauma is, people who've experienced trauma. And I think when you hold anything so close to you, you're not able to see it objectively. And
that's true, because you're still the main center of the universe. You're the subject.
Right.
And a lot of times we do look at things subjectively, because of how it impacts us. And to do anything in life, you have to be able to look at things objectively, right, as a professional, as a parent. So that matters. So I was going to wrap it up.
Okay.
So I guess what the takeaways is, find a community that's going to challenge your worldviews and how you think, because it matters. It could be the difference in taking you to that next level. Right. The second thing is, everybody does not have trauma. It becomes trauma based off of how we perceive the experience. Trauma is when you start to feel very helpless and hopeless. And if you are an adult, think about where you are today and what areas of your life do you feel helpless and hopeless. Now, some people may not have access to resources, so they very much so may still feel helpless and hopeless. But if you do have resources and you're still sending that message of this is traumatic, and everybody says it too, oh girl, that was traumatizing. Be mindful of how you use that language, because there really are people that are living with PTSD and mental illnesses. And if we're not mindful of that language, I think that we do so many other people a disservice. And I think that that's why I didn't want to talk about it, because I have actually seen people that really don't have the ability to do what we're doing right now. And it's not that they're not spiritual or they don't believe in God, but at some point, some people lose the ability to be able to function the way that you and I do. So those are our tips on trauma. This is episode 4, but we've only released 2. Episode 3 is dropping on Wednesday. You can follow us on Instagram at Success is Complicated. We're also on YouTube. Please leave comments if there are topics that you would like for us to talk about, and just offering a different perspective. We're happy to look into that and just share more. We hope that you have enjoyed this episode. And until next time.
All right.